clink of porcelain cups and the low hum of conversation filled Café Belle Vista, a place that was less a cafe and more a stage for Manhattan's elite. Everything inside gleamed with intention, the marble tables polished to a mirror-like shine, the golden light from crystal chandeliers softened to flatter expensive jewelry, and the hushed tones of investment talk that could shift markets by breakfast the next morning. Every patron carried themselves as if the city revolved around their presence. For most, it did. At the center table by the window sat the Ashfords. To outsiders, they looked like the picture of privilege. Thomas, the powerful CEO whose company controlled billions, his wife Victoria, immaculately dressed in a designer suit that screamed both money and status, and their daughter Emma, a fragile 8-year-old with hair the color of spun gold. Yet beneath that perfect tableau, cracks spread like fault lines beneath glass. Thomas stirred his espresso slowly, his gaze not on the glowing phone beside him, nor on the glittering skyline beyond the window, but on his daughter. Emma sat silently, hands folded in her lap, her wide eyes distant. She had not spoken a word since that day 2 years ago, when a sudden accident stole more than her voice. Her silence was not only an absence of sound, it was an absence of presence. Thomas missed her laugh, the way she used to chatter endlessly about stories she made up. Now she was a quiet shadow in a noisy world. Victoria, however, didn't notice the shadow. She tapped her nails impatiently against the marble table, scanning the room to see who might be watching them. To her, Emma's silence was a weakness, a flaw that needed fixing, or worse, hiding. "She looks pale today," Victoria muttered, brushing an invisible speck of dust from her child's shoulder. "Thomas, we need to find a new therapist. The last one was clearly useless. 2 years and not a single word." Her voice, though low, carried the edge of disdain. Thomas sighed. He had grown accustomed to his wife's sharpness, but it cut deeper when it was aimed at their daughter. He wanted to protest, to remind her that Emma wasn't broken, just wounded, but he didn't. He never did. The weight of his silence mirrored Emma's own. And then something happened. A young waitress approached their table, balancing a tray with the kind of grace only years of practice could teach. She was striking, not in the way of glittering wealth, but in the way of resilience. Her dark eyes held a quiet strength, her posture upright yet unassuming. She set down their drinks with precision, offering a polite smile. But as her gaze fell on Emma, something shifted. Instead of turning away, as so many did when faced with the girl's silence, the waitress paused. For a heartbeat, the bustling cafe seemed to dim around them. She lifted her hand and with deliberate gentleness traced a simple gesture in the air, a sign, just one word, but one Emma understood. Emma's eyes widened. For the first time in months, her lips parted, not in speech but in something even more precious. A smile, small, fleeting, but real. Thomas froze, his spoon clattering against the saucer. He hadn't seen that smile in years. His heart clenched, caught between joy and disbelief. Victoria, on the other hand, stiffened instantly. Her perfectly painted lips curled as if she had just witnessed a crime. "What on earth is she doing?" she hissed under her breath, glaring at the waitress. "Making strange gestures at my daughter like it's some kind of circus trick." But Thomas barely heard her. His eyes were fixed on Emma, who was clumsily trying to copy the sign with her tiny hands, her face glowing with the timid hope of a child who had just discovered a hidden door in a locked house. The cafe around them continued with its polished rhythm, servers moving swiftly, businessmen murmuring over contracts, but at that table, everything had changed. None of them knew it yet, but a single sign had just set in motion a story that would shake the very foundations of power and pride in that glittering world. And for the first time in years, Thomas Ashford felt something stir inside him too. A quiet realization that perhaps salvation doesn't always come from the top floors of skyscrapers or the words of specialists. Sometimes it arrives softly, in the unlikeliest of places, carried by the hands of someone the world never thought to listen to. The cafe was alive with its usual symphony, silver spoons clinking against porcelain, the soft shuffle of designer heels across polished floors, the muted rhythm of conversations that dealt more in power than in words. Yet at the Ashfords' table, silence clung to the air like a storm waiting to break. Emma's smile lingered, fragile but luminous, as though a forgotten flame had flickered back to life. She tried again, lifting her little hands with uncertain precision, copying the gesture the waitress had shown her. Her fingers bent clumsily, trembling, but her eyes shone with determination. Thomas felt his chest tighten. He could hardly breathe. That single, imperfect sign carried more weight than all the board meetings, all the accolades, all the hollow victories that filled his life. For 2 years, he had watched his daughter retreat further and further into silence. And now, this, a small spark lit by a stranger's kindness. But Victoria saw only insult. Her chair scraped loudly against the marble as she stood. Heads turned, the hush of privileged whispers spread like ripples in a pond. Her voice, sharp and indignant, sliced through the room. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" She jabbed a manicured finger toward the young waitress. "Are you mocking my daughter with those ridiculous hand-eye tricks?" The waitress froze. For a moment, her hands hovered in the air, caught mid-motion. She wasn't used to being seen this way, invisible most of the time, and when not, dismissed. But she steadied herself, her eyes gentle as they flickered from Victoria's fury to Emma's pleading gaze. "I was only trying to communicate," she said, her voice soft but clear. She understood me. Victoria's laugh was sharp and cruel. "Communicate? With that? Don't be absurd. My daughter needs real therapy, not some circus act performed by the help." She spat the last word with venom, her voice loud enough that even the farthest corners of the cafe fell silent. Thomas's face burned with humiliation. He could feel every pair of eyes in the room on them, some wide with curiosity, others narrowed with judgment. His throat ached to speak, to stop the scene spiraling further, but years of living under Victoria's domineering presence had conditioned him into restraint. And yet, before he could find his words, a smaller voice broke through. "Nice." The word was fragile, a whisper barely strong enough to reach across the table, but it was Emma's voice. Thomas dropped his napkin, his entire body jolting as if struck by lightning. He turned to his daughter, his heart pounding in disbelief. "Emma?" he whispered. Emma looked at him, her cheeks flushed with effort. She pointed shyly at the waitress, then repeated the word, just a little stronger. "Nice." It was the first word she had spoken in 2 years. Gasps fluttered through the cafe. A couple at the next table lowered their phones, stunned. The barista behind the counter forgot the milk frother hissing at her side. For a brief, impossible moment, the entire room was united in a stunned, collective silence. The waitress's eyes softened, a smile touching her lips. She nodded slowly, lifting her hands again to repeat the sign with delim. "Ike clarity." Emma mimicked her, more confidently this time. Victoria's face, however, hardened into stone. Her pride cracked under the weight of her daughter's fragile words, but instead of awe, fury took its place. Her voice rose, trembling with anger. "This is manipulation. You don't get to play games with my child." She turned toward the counter, her voice shrill. "Manager, where is your manager? I want this woman fired immediately." The tension in the cafe coiled tighter, as though the air itself were holding its breath. The waitress stood firm, her chin lifted with quiet dignity. She did not cower, did not apologize. Instead, her fingers brushed against the small digital recorder hidden in her apron pocket. She had seen this before. The sneer of entitlement, the venom of prejudice, the attempt to make kindness look like offense. But this moment was different. For the first time, the silence of a child had been broken. And for the first time in years, Thomas Ashford realized his silence might destroy more than just his reputation. It might destroy the only chance his daughter had to find her voice again. The cafe, once a temple of privilege, had become an arena. Every eye was locked on their table, every camera phone was raised. And though no one knew it yet, the first move in a far greater battle had just been made. Thomas's hand trembled as he set down his espresso cup, the porcelain rattling against the saucer. His daughter's voice, thin, fragile, but unmistakably hers, still echoed in his mind. He wanted to cradle it, hold on to that single word forever, as though it were the first note of a symphony he'd been waiting years to hear. But the moment was already under attack. Victoria loomed over the table like a storm, her face flushed, her hands clenched. She didn't see a miracle. She saw a threat, to her control, to her image, to the pristine facade she had built around her family. "Enough of this nonsense," she snapped, her voice pitched high enough to turn more heads. "This woman is confusing her, filling her head with meaningless gestures. It's disgraceful." The waitress, calm, even in the eye of the storm, did not flinch. She glanced at Emma, who sat with trembling hands half raised, her fingers still mimicking the sign. The little girl's eyes were wide, begging silently for permission to keep going. That look, raw, pleading, alive, was all the waitress needed to steady her ground. "My name is Keisha," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those who had leaned in. "And I wasn't mocking her. I was speaking to her in a language she understands." A ripple of whispers spread across the cafe. Sign language, someone murmured. Another voice, sharper, countered. She's deaf, isn't she? That's why she works here. Makes sense. A third voice. But the girl spoke. I heard her. Thomas's chest constricted. He felt the weight of every whisper pressing down on him, forcing him to choose a side. For years, he had been a man of decisions, buying companies, firing executives, shaping empires with a signature on a dotted line. Yet here, with his daughter's tiny voice still vibrating in the air, he sat frozen, unable to choose between his domineering wife and his fragile child. Emma tugged at his sleeve. Her small hand was trembling, but her eyes burned with a new kind of determination. Slowly, haltingly, she raised her chin toward Keisha and whispered again, "Nice." It was quieter this time, but to Thomas, it was louder than any boardroom declaration he had ever made. He felt tears prick the corners of his eyes, tears he hadn't allowed himself in decades. Victoria's expression turned venomous. She leaned closer to Thomas, her voice a hiss meant for him alone. Do something. End this. Now. But Thomas couldn't. Not this time. Something inside him cracked. The years of silence, the endless compromises, and the way he had let his wife dictate every corner of their family's life. He looked at Emma, at the way her face glowed with hope for the first time in years, and realized that if he failed her now, he would lose her forever. His lips parted, but the words stuck in his throat. Fear still clung to him. Fear of confrontation, fear of scandal, fear of losing the carefully crafted empire he and Victoria had built. He faltered, his courage trembling like a candle in the wind. And in that hesitation, it was Keisha who acted. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. Instead, she lowered herself slightly, bringing her eyes level with Emma's. Her hands moved gracefully, repeating the sign for nice with patience, then adding another simple word, friend. Emma's face lit up, a sound bubbling from her throat, a laugh, broken, breathy, but real. A laugh that drew startled gasps from the surrounding tables. Thomas's heart nearly collapsed under the weight of it. That sound, absent for so long, was worth more than every dollar in his bank account. But Victoria's fury reached its peak. She snatched her purse from the table and shouted across the room, her voice shrill and commanding, "Manager, this is unacceptable. If this girl isn't fired, I will ruin this place. Do you hear me? I will ruin you all." Every eye was on them now. Cameras clicked, phones recorded, the once private dispute transformed into a public spectacle. The cafe manager hurried forward, pale and sweating, caught between a millionaire's wrath and a waitress's quiet defiance. And through it all, Keisha remained calm, her hand slipping briefly into her apron pocket, pressing against a small recorder that blinked silently. Evidence. Proof. She had been preparing for this moment far longer than anyone could imagine. For Thomas, the world tilted. His wife's voice, sharp and venomous, seemed to fade behind. The echo of his daughter's laugh. In that laugh, he heard truth. He heard freedom. And he understood, with a clarity that left him breathless, that silence, his silence, was no longer an option. Something was about to break, and when it did, nothing in their world would ever look the same again. Night fell heavy over Manhattan, but the city never truly slept. Lights from the towers glowed like constellations against the black sky, and in a cramped walk-up apartment miles from Café Belle Vista, Keisha Johnson sat at her kitchen table, staring at the small recorder she had slipped into her apron pocket earlier that day. Her hands trembled, though not from fear, from focus, from the weight of everything she had carried, waiting for this moment. She pressed play, and Victoria Ashford's voice hissed through the tiny speaker, sharp, entitled, dripping with disdain. The words filled the room like smoke. "Are you mocking my daughter? If this girl isn't fired, I will ruin this place." Keisha exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. She had dozens of recordings like this. For 5 years, she had been documenting the cruelty of the powerful men and women who treated her as invisible, less than, undeserving of the air she breathed. At first, it had been for her own survival, a way to prove she wasn't making it up, a way to fight back in secret. But over time, it had grown into something larger, a project, a mission. She called it Project Awakening. Inside a worn shoebox beneath her bed, organized with meticulous care, were flash drives and transcripts, videos clipped from security cameras, even handwritten accounts from other employees too afraid to speak up. She had spent sleepless nights compiling patterns, building cases, connecting dots, and now fate had placed the Ashfords directly in her path. Keisha rubbed her temples, memories flickering in fragments. Growing up in Brooklyn, She had been the kid no one wanted to teach. Deaf by birth, shuffled through underfunded schools, dismissed by teachers who assumed her silence meant stupidity. But her mother, tough, unbreakable, taught her otherwise. Your silence is not your weakness, she signed to her daughter. It is your weapon. Use it when the world underestimates you. Her mother had worked double shifts to buy her first signing dictionary, and Keisha devoured it. Later, she learned to lip read, to navigate both the hearing world and her own. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was watching, listening in her own way, storing everything the privileged thought no one noticed. And now, at Café Bella Vista, that silence had become her strength. Emma Ashford's face haunted her thoughts, the way the little girl's eyes lit up when their hands connected in that simple word, nice. It hadn't been just communication, it had been recognition, a lifeline thrown into waters where Emma had been drowning for 2 long years. Keisha knew what was coming. Victoria Ashford wouldn't stop until she got her fired. Tomorrow, maybe even tonight, the phone call would come. The cafe manager, terrified of losing the favor of the elite, would fold like paper. But Keisha wasn't afraid. She had been waiting for this kind of confrontation, preparing for it with every cruel word, every dismissive glance, every insult recorded and filed away. The Ashfords weren't just another rich family with too much power. Thomas Ashford's name was tied to a massive children's foundation, one that publicly praised diversity and inclusion. On glossy brochures, he posed with children of every background, smiling as though he were a savior. But his silence at that cafe told a different story. And Victoria, she was worse. The recordings of her cruelty alone could shatter reputations. But to expose them would take more than evidence. It would take timing, precision, and courage. Keisha's phone buzzed, a text from Dr. Williams. Saw the video. Oh, online. Call me, we're ready. Her pulse quickened. She hadn't expected it to spread so quickly, but of course someone in the cafe had filmed it. By now, strangers on the internet were already dissecting Victoria's words, replaying Emma's small whisper, marveling at the waitress who signed. The story had left the walls of Café Bella Vista and was starting to seep into the bloodstream of the city itself. Keisha closed her eyes, the corners of her lips curving into the faintest smile. For the first time in years, she felt momentum, like the tide was finally turning. Tomorrow would not be about survival. It would be about confrontation. And Emma Ashford, the mute child who had found her voice through sign, would be the spark that ignited it all. The cafe was more crowded than usual, the air thick with the mingling scents of roasted espresso and expensive perfume. Conversations hummed from every corner, but at the Ashfords' table, tension had turned the space into a stage. Eyes flicked toward them discreetly, some curious, some outright expectant. Word of the scene a few days prior had spread like wildfire. People were waiting, hungry for drama, hungry for cracks in the perfection of the Ashfords. Emma sat tucked into her chair, her small fingers drumming lightly against the rim of her glass of water. To anyone else, it was a meaningless fidget. To Thomas, who had been watching her with the intensity of a drowning man searching for air, it was something more. She had been practicing the signs the waitress, Keisha, had shown her. Practicing in secret, away from her mother's glare. Thomas's throat tightened as he realized how alive Emma seemed lately, how the spark in her eyes had grown stronger every day since that first sign. She wasn't healed, not yet, but she was reaching toward the world again, and Keisha was the reason. Victoria, however, remained blind. She sipped her cappuccino with deliberate elegance, her lipstick smile a mask stretched too tight. I've already spoken with Dr. Hammond, she said sharply, her words aimed at Thomas, but meant for the room. He assures me we can begin a more aggressive therapy for Emma. Real professionals, not parlor tricks from waitresses. Her tone made Thomas's jaw clench. He wanted to speak, to challenge her, but the weight of years of silence pressed him down. He hated himself for it. And then Emma did something no one expected. She pushed back her chair and stood. The scrape of wood against marble was loud enough to cut through the hum of conversation. Heads turned, forks paused midair. Even the barista froze, milk frother hissing unattended. Emma's small body trembled, but her eyes, God, her eyes, burned with a fire Thomas hadn't seen since before the accident. She lifted her chin and with a voice both shaky and determined said, "You're mean, Mommy." The words shattered the cafe's stillness like glass. Gasps rippled through the room. Victoria's cappuccino cup slipped in her hand, spilling brown liquid across the pristine tablecloth. Her face went pale, then blotched with fury. "What did you just say?" she hissed, her voice rising. Emma's chest heaved, but she didn't falter. She raised her hands and signed the word Keisha had shown her again and again. Friend. Then she spoke, louder this time, her voice breaking but clear. "She helped me." Thomas's breath caught. Pride swelled in his chest, pride so fierce it ached. His daughter was speaking, truly speaking, for the first time in 2 years, and not just with words, but with courage. Keisha, standing a few tables away with a tray in her hands, froze. Her eyes filled with something she fought to hold back, tears she couldn't afford to let fall here. She gave Emma the smallest nod, a promise, an anchor. The cafe erupted. Some patrons clapped, others whispered, phones came out, cameras flashed. This wasn't just a family mom. Ain't anymore. This was a public reckoning. Victoria's voice cut through the commotion, high and venomous. You think this is progress? You think this is therapy? This spectacle? She's being used. Her eyes snapped toward Keisha, her fury unrestrained. You manipulated her, Enough! The word didn't come from Emma or Keisha or any of the whispering onlookers. It came from Thomas. His voice was deep, steady, carrying a finality that silenced even Victoria. For once, he wasn't a background figure. For once, he wasn't silent. He pulled Emma close, holding her trembling frame against him, and looked directly at his wife. She spoke, Victoria. She spoke, and you can't take that away from her. The cafe held its breath. For Thomas, this was the beginning of something he had feared for years, defying his wife. But when he looked down at Emma, when he felt her heartbeat steadying against his chest, he knew it wasn't fear anymore. It was resolve. Victoria's mouth opened, but no words came. Her power, her control, her grip on the narrative, all of it cracked under the weight of that moment. And though she didn't yet realize it, the cracks would only grow wider. Across the room, Keisha's hand brushed against her apron pocket, feeling the reassuring shape of her recorder. The pieces were moving into place. The battle had only just begun. The private room upstairs had always been the pride of Café Belle Vista, with velvet curtains, polished mahogany walls, and a chandelier that bathed everything in golden light. It was where Manhattan's power brokers gathered to make decisions that rippled through the city. But that Thursday afternoon, the air inside was charged differently, thick, restless, expectant. Victoria Ashford presided at the head of the long table, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she smoothed a stack of papers she hadn't even read. She was glowing, triumphant, certain that today's charity committee meeting would restore her authority after the humiliations of the past weeks. Around her sat the city's most carefully curated women, socialites, philanthropists, board members, each of them sipping champagne and waiting for Victoria to begin. Before we vote on funding allocations, Victoria said, her voice bright and practiced, I want to share a personal experience that illustrates why we must be selective about the causes we support. She leaned forward, savoring the moment. 2 weeks ago, a disabled waitress here attempted to manipulate my daughter with tricks that... The door opened. The interruption was so unexpected the room fell instantly quiet. Dr. Marcus Williams entered first, his presence commanding without effort, followed by Keisha. But this wasn't the Keisha the committee had dismissed as a waitress. She wore a sharp blazer, her posture straight, her eyes steady. She looked like she belonged. No, more than that. She looked like she was about to take control. Victoria's face drained of color. What is the meaning of this? She demanded, half rising from her chair. Allow me to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Williams said calmly, his baritone smooth, his authority undeniable. Keisha Johnson, founder of the Awakening Project. She's here to present findings on institutional discrimination in elite spaces, findings that affect this very committee. The women around the table shifted uncomfortably. They glanced between Victoria and Keisha, uncertain whose side to take. The balance of power tilted in the silence. Keisha didn't waste a second. She connected her laptop to the projector and with a single keystroke, filled the room with the frozen image of Victoria mid-scream in the cafe, finger stabbing the air. A caption appeared beneath it, documented discriminatory behavior. Gasps rippled through the room. Then came the audio, crystal clear, Victoria's voice shrieking, That person is manipulating my daughter with cheap tricks. How dare you hire someone like that to serve decent people? The silence that followed was suffocating. That, Victoria sputtered, her carefully constructed facade cracking. That was taken out of context. Context. Keisha's voice was calm, surgical. Let's add some. Another slide appeared. A recording of Victoria on the phone, her voice cool and deliberate. We need to make sure Emma understands the difference between temporary charity and relationships appropriate for her social class. The committee members' faces hardened. The whispers grew louder. Margaret Thornton, the eldest and most respected member, leaned forward, her expression like steel. Victoria, is this your voice? Victoria stammered. I was protecting my daughter. Keisha cut her off, her tone sharp but controlled. Your daughter. who flourished when given the freedom to communicate in sign language. Your daughter, who broke 2 years of silence because someone dared to see her as capable. That's not protection, Mrs. Ashford. That's prejudice disguised as concern. As if on cue, the door opened again. Emma entered the room, her small hand tucked in Thomas's. Every head turned. The little girl walked forward, her steps hesitant, but her eyes unwavering. She looked at the women around the table, then at her mother, and began to sign. "My name is Emma," she said aloud, her hands moving in perfect rhythm. "I didn't speak because people yelled at me. Keisha taught me I can talk with my hands. My mom said people like Keisha shouldn't work here. That's not true. Keisha is my friend." The room went still. Some women clutched at their necklaces. Others blinked back tears. Victoria's lips parted, but no words came. For the first time, she looked small, diminished in the face of her own child's truth. Margaret Thornton stood, her voice firm. "Victoria, I believe it's time for you to resign as chair of this committee." The decision fell like a hammer. The whispers became open agreement, nods, murmurs of, "Yes, yes, it's the only way." Dr. Williams laid a final document on the table. "And before you dismiss this as a personal attack, let me add, this is not just about Victoria Ashford. Ms. Johnson has compiled evidence documenting a systemic pattern of discrimination across multiple establishments, including ones represented in this very room. We will be submitting this to the Federal Commission for investigation." Victoria's carefully maintained world cracked in full view. Her friends avoided her eyes, their admiration replaced with shame. Her husband stood silently beside their daughter, his allegiance clear. And Keisha, once invisible, dismissed, underestimated, stood at the head of the table, holding all the power. The chandelier light caught the sheen of tears in Emma's eyes as she reached for Keisha's hand and whispered, "Justice." For a moment, no one breathed. And then, like the toll of a bell, the realization sank in. This wasn't just the collapse of Victoria Ashford's reputation. This was the beginning of something much bigger, a reckoning that would ripple through every gilded room in Manhattan. 6 months later, Café Belle Vista looked nothing like the exclusive stronghold it had once been. The marble. Its tables still gleamed, the chandeliers still glittered, and the coffee still carried the rich aroma of perfection. But the soul of the place had transformed. Where silence and superiority once reigned, now laughter mingled with the hum of conversations in multiple languages: English, Spanish, French, and, most striking of all, sign language. Families who had once felt unwelcome now found themselves drawn to the cafe, eager to be part of something authentic. On weekends, the back corner was reserved for children learning sign language, their tiny hands moving clumsily but joyfully. Emma Ashford often led the group, her notebook of signs dog-eared and filled with doodles. At only 9 years old, she had become something of a symbol, not just of recovery, but of inclusion itself. "Slow down, Emma," Keisha teased one Saturday afternoon as Emma taught a new boy how to sign friend. Emma giggled, her hands flying with confidence, her voice breaking through only when she chose. She was no longer silent. She was free. Keisha, once the invisible waitress no one looked at twice, now carried herself with authority. She was Café Belle Vista's Director of Inclusion and Diversity, a position created specifically for her, one that paid more than many of the customers who used to sneer at her apron. But the job was more than a title. She had built programs, hired interpreters, and developed workshops so effective that companies across Manhattan were begging her to consult. Universities invited her to speak. Newspapers ran profiles on her, yet through all the spotlight she remained grounded, her eyes always on the next child, the next voice waiting to be heard. Thomas Ashford was a changed man too. He sat at the cafe that same afternoon, watching Emma guide her friends, his chest swelling with something he hadn't felt in years: peace. He had stepped into the role of a true father, no longer shadowed by Victoria's dominance. His foundation, once criticized for performative charity, now allocated the majority of its resources to genuine inclusion programs. He spoke publicly about what he had learned, admitting his failures with humility. "My daughter didn't just regain her voice," he told a television audience. "She taught me what it means to listen." Victoria, however, lived another story. Stripped of her committee chairmanships, rejected from every social circle she had once ruled, she had fled Manhattan for a quieter suburb. But the internet never forgot. Every time she tried to reinvent herself, her past resurfaced. A viral video, a headline, a comment thread that reminded her of the cafe and the day her daughter had spoken the truth. At coffee shops far less glamorous than Belle Vista, she sat alone, bitterness etched into every line of her face. Back in Manhattan, Margaret Thornton rose to her new role as chair of the charity committee with a mission. She cited the Ashford scandal as a turning point, reminding her peers that charity without self-examination was hypocrisy. The first place we must practice inclusion, she declared at a gala, is in our own hearts. Keisha's methods of meticulous documentation had spread too. Dr. Williams now taught young attorneys across the country how to build ironclad cases against systemic discrimination. What began as one waitress with a hidden recorder had become a movement. But the most powerful transformation wasn't in the courtrooms or the boardrooms. It was in the simple, everyday interactions at Café Bella Vista. A banker signing his order to a barista, a child teaching her parents the sign for love. Deaf and hearing, rich and poor, black and white, sitting together not out of obligation, but out of choice. One golden evening, as the sun dipped behind Manhattan's skyline, Keisha stood by the cafe's wide windows and watched Emma. The little girl was signing "I love you" to each child as they left. Her hands sure, her smile radiant. "Do you think my mom can change?" Emma asked softly when the others were gone, her eyes wide with hope. Keisha knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "People can change if they want to," she said gently. "But real change doesn't come from others forcing it. It has to come from inside." Emma nodded, her small fingers forming the sign for justice. Keisha smiled, her heart swelling with quiet pride. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It never truly had been. It was about building something stronger, something more beautiful than the hate that had tried to silence her. And as the last light of day poured across the cafe, illuminating faces of every background, every voice, every way of speaking, Keisha understood the truth. Victoria Ashford had tried to destroy her. Instead, she had destroyed only herself. Because the sweetest justice was not in anyone's downfall. It was in this moment, in this cafe, in this new world where silence no longer meant invisibility. A world where voices, spoken, signed, whispered, or shouted, were finally heard.